So Boker Tov, if that is the case for you. And we'll start, of course, with our bracha and welcome everyone. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we're going to, thank you, we're going to not do what we normally do in the morning, but we're going to, well, look, we have a guest. That's lovely. Hi, Boker Tov Ahuva. Good to see you. We're going to talk, I mentioned yesterday that I would talk a little bit about how the service got to be the service. And it's actually the source of it is in Brachot, in Tractate Brachot, the Talmud, page 26b. I don't remember that. I looked it up to make sure I could give you that reference, 26b in the Gemara in Tractate Brachot. And it gives two reasons for why we pray 3 times a day. And of course, we add others as well. So one source for all of this originally, right, for the daily offerings is found in the book of Numbers, somewhere around chapter 28, in Parshat Pinchas, where the statutory offerings are mentioned. So understand that offerings could be voluntary, or they could be driven by a vow, or they were public and statutory, and that's what's mentioned in Parshat Pinchas. Starting off with a daily Tamid offering, that is morning and late afternoon, and the Tamid, which was a lamb every day, 2 lambs, a lamb in the morning and a lamb in the evening, and then moving on to the additional lambs brought, 2 additional lambs brought on Shabbat. In other words, we go from the most frequent to the less frequent. So we go to Shabbat, and then it discusses Rosh Chodesh, and then it goes through Pesach, Shavuot. It also talks about, I think it also talks about the Omer, and it also talks about, I may not be correct about that though, because it really is talking about the offerings that were brought on the festivals, so Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret. So those are all mentioned, the specific offerings and the additional offerings that are mentioned in the Torah. So here's what happened. They had the centralization of the sacrificial worship, as we talked about yesterday. And of course, not everyone lives in Jerusalem. And this was something that people recognized as being extremely essential and beautiful. You can only imagine, the structure of the temple and how beautiful it was. And then the very impressive ceremonies of the priests offering in a very formal kind of way. We still respect these kinds of behaviors where every step, as it were, is thought out. So if you've been to the tomb of the unknown soldier and you've watched the changing of the guard there, you know that there's significance to every single step, there's significance to the uniform, every little piece has significance to it. And you can only imagine the Levites singing in chorus. This was something very, very impressive. But people lived far away from Jerusalem. They didn't live real close by. And they still lived in Eretz Yisrael, and they wanted to feel that they were a part of what was going on. And we have what are called the Ma'amadot, And as I understand it, this is not actually mentioned in Brachot, because that's what discusses how we get to 3 services a day. But as I learned myself back in rabbinical school, that what would happen is that representatives of the communities, of the outlying communities, would go and observe what was going on in the temple on behalf of the community. So there was a great sense of obligation, or how can I say, duty, a sense that this was something that God had commanded, and that this was in a proper way, as best as one could try as a human being, to formally worship, to engage in formal worship with Hashem. And there clearly are sensibilities and sensitivities that we don't have by and large in Western culture. But to understand how the people felt connected to the temple. And the story is that while their representatives were in the temple watching and observing what was going on there, back in the communities themselves, they knew what time of day these things were going on. And they would meet back in their communities and offer up probably psalms and other kinds of elements of worship to feel connected to the people, to the people who were from their community at the temple. And they suspect that this was the very beginnings of what we now do at the synagogues. This was the very, very beginning of synagogue worship, because synagogue worship seems very, very different from what was going on in the temple. But this is a way of understanding some level of connectivity between the two. Now, the temple, of course, was subsequently destroyed. And I realize that for many people, even the whole idea of sacrificial worship, et cetera, not that important or repugnant. But the truth is that when the temple was destroyed, when that first temple was destroyed, it could have spelled the very end of Judaism, of the Hebrew religion, etc. After all, when the 10 northern tribes of Israel were destroyed by the Assyrians, there's a reason why we talk about the 10 lost tribes, because basically the Assyrians assimilated them into their empire. And we are very fortunate that the Babylonians had a very different policy. They retained the integrity of communities because the Babylonians understood what is important for every responsible government to do, more important than anything else, collect taxes. And they felt that if they put that responsibility on the various communities they conquered, that would be easier than trying to administrate all this stuff on their own. So the Jewish community remained intact in Babylonia in the exile. They had a leader called the Exilarch, and they were allowed to function as a community, and they could retain their identity as such. One of the greatest leaders that we ever had, whose name is known not necessarily to that many people, but anyone who's educated Jewishly has heard of him, and his name was Ezra the scribe. And he lived, I would say, around the years 500 BCE. And he collected around himself 70 of the smartest, wisest, most learned people, and it was called the Men of the Great Assembly. And I suspect that it was within this framework that the Torah, as we now have it, is there, that they helped put that together. And I have some reasons for suspecting that. There's a statement in the rabbinic tradition that had Moses not received the Torah, Ezra would have been worthy of receiving the Torah. There are also statements in Ezra and possibly Nehemiah, they were contemporaries, about how they assembled people and read the Torah to them. And what I suspect, even though I'm getting off my subject, that what essentially they had were various sources that they then put put into a way, synthesized in the way that we have the Torah today, so that we could study the Torah and get the most out of it, make the most sense out of it. One of the things they also did, these were incredibly learned people, is they created the words of the Shmona Esrei, of the Amidah. And they were aware that they wanted these particular parts of the service, that is the Amidah of the service, to represent the moment when the offerings were brought, those statutory offerings were brought. And this is what is mentioned, one of the reasons mentioned actually in the tractate Berachot 26b, where they talk about how Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly established the Amidah to take place in the place of these actual animal sacrifices. And there are rules involved in saying the Amidah. So, for example, you can only say Shachrit from the time in the morning when they would bring the Tamid offering to the time when they could no longer bring the Tamid, the morning, it was no longer considered the morning offering. There are specific times and brackets in which one can bring these offerings, and say these prayers. So you can't say mincha too early. There's a discussion as to when is the best time to say mincha, which of course is corresponding to the afternoon offering. And of course, there's a question which is, how about Ma'ariv? How about the third service? Because they only brought 2 statutory offerings every day, the Shacharit and the Mincha. So what about Ma'ariv? Well, if we examine Ma'ariv, we realize that there's certain structural issues about Ma'ariv that are unique and that what applies to Ma'ariv doesn't necessarily apply to Shachrit and Mincha. We know that with both Shachrit and Mincha, if there's a minyan, you get to repeat the Amidah in some form or another. You get to state the Amidah publicly. You don't do that with Ma'ariv. Ma'ariv is not repeated under pretty much any circumstances. Another factor is that for a long, long time, Ma'ariv was considered optional. However, at a certain point in Jewish history, the Jewish people took it upon themselves to make Ma'ariv obligatory. And according to the Talmud, Ma'ariv corresponds to the time when they would burn off the remnants of the sacrifices on the altar. And so that's a connection that is made between Ma'ariv and the sacrificial offerings. I think that one could certainly reflect heavily on the significance of this, that there's something unique about Ma'ariv, and that symbolically it may represent issues that are better expressed through the way it's done in the burning the remnants of the sacrifices, even though normally you know that a Jewish day begins with Ma'ariv, the liturgical day starts with Ma'ariv. Nevertheless, with sacrifices, that was not the order. The order for sacrifices was the morning offering, the afternoon offering, and then burning off the remnants of the sacrifices on the altar.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, because Mincha, we don't do the Shema.
Correct.
And but for Shacharit and Ma'ariv, we do.
Yes.
So wouldn't that be a reason to have Ma'ariv?
I see what you're saying. You could say that. I thought you were going to ask a different question, is why don't we say the Shema at Mincha? But you probably know the answer to that.
No, I don't.
Okay. So so understand that it is the Amidah, which is a rabbinic mitzvah, right? This is not in the Torah. It's a mitzvah that was developed by the rabbis, is what makes service a service. It is the essential. If you don't say the Amidah in your prayers, you're basically saying prayers. Not saying that isn't good. It has a very different value than reciting the Amidah, which is there in fulfillment of what we can no longer fulfill through the sacrifices. So the point about it is that there's a mitzvah to say the Shema, but the mitzvah to say the Shema is completely different. It is a mitzvah that's found in the Torah. Saying the Shema twice a day, morning and night, is a mitzvah that's stated explicitly in the Torah, actually 4 times. In Shema, and it's not 4 times. It's in the Shema and Vahaya im Shamoa, and the tzitzit, the 3rd paragraph, doesn't mention it, and it's a separate mitzvah too, and there's a discussion in Brachot as to whether you should be saying that 3rd paragraph at night, and the decision was made that using midrashic applications that you say that at night as well. I'm not going to give you the details of that particular discussion, but know that what happened is that they rolled the saying of the Shema, the recitation of the Shema, into Shacharit and Ma'ariv in order to compress things a little bit and they realized that if they made it a separate, totally separate mitzvah and didn't make it part of the ritual of the prayers, people might not observe it.
Okay.
So it is not an essential part of the service in terms of how I'm describing it. It's a separate mitzvah from the Amidah. Now,
Okay. I have a question also about the time.
Yes, go ahead.
No, when do you say it? Is it sundown?
Are you talking about the Shema or are you talking about the Amidah?
The Ma'ariv service.
Okay, there's actually a lot of halachic discussion. The very first Mishnah of Tractate Brachot, which discusses prayer, discusses the time for Ma'ariv. And there's this disagreement between Rashi and Tosafot there, and some of the other commentators then also bring their opinions in. And because there's a question as to how early you can say Ma'ariv, and whether or not that is too early to fulfill the mitzvah of the Shema, of reciting the Shema. And so Rashi has a very interesting commentary at the very beginning there, and essentially it comes out that reciting the Shema at bedtime might be the essential actual practice of fulfilling the mitzvah. So we have to be conscious that there's a difference, or sensitive to the idea that there's a difference of reciting a prayer because we want to do it or because it stimulates us, as opposed to doing it because it's a duty to perform it. So are we doing this to fulfill the mitzvah before God, or are we doing this because we find it stimulating and inspiring, etc., etc.? And there is a distinction between those two things. So there is a discussion as to whether or not you have to say the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema when you go to bed at night, as opposed to during Ma'ariv. There are some places which are very meticulous about not starting Ma'ariv before nightfall, because if you do start Ma'ariv at nightfall, then of course it is the time to say the evening Shema as well as the Amidah. But many, many, many places where there is a practice of, coming to Minyan and feeling that that's an important part of the day, an essential duty, they will start Ma'ariv earlier. They will do it in conjunction with Mincha, right after Mincha. That's a very old practice, and essentially because they wanted to make it possible for people who wanted to practice the mitzvot to be able to practice the mitzvot, and not to throw curveballs and make it hard. There were also reasons that back then people were working in the fields, and if they waited until nightfall, there was a possibility that they would be endangering themselves from bandits, etc. There wasn't good lighting, etc., etc. So there were reasons why, because we want the religion to be practical. We want it to be practiced and not simply be nice words. And so that's why these things have happened. So there really are very good and interesting reasons as to why some of these things developed. So while I have the time, because I'm using up my time very quickly, there's another reason given in Brachot as to why we pray 3 times a day. And that is that the Shacharit service corresponds to our patriarch Abraham, that the Mincha service corresponds to our patriarch Isaac, and the Ma'ariv service corresponds to our patriarch Jacob. And there are verses in the Torah that lend support to the idea that Abraham prayed in the morning, that it mentions about a prayer that Abraham offers in the morning. And the word for prayer is understood to refer to this Amidah, because we come before God during the Amidah. That's why we stand. And then it talks about Yitzchak, where I can remember the verse, when Rebecca, Eliezer, we think it was, Eliezer and Rebecca came back together Isaac was meditating in the field, lasuach basadeh, and it says, towards the end of the day. So that's understood as mincha, and of course we know that Jacob came to Peniel at nightfall, and that's when he prayed to God. And of course we even have the prayer, at least the words of what he said. Now, clearly, there's a lot more significance. Unfortunately, we sometimes, I think, as you've heard me, ride off on this one, get distracted by the fact that it's the patriarchs, et cetera, et cetera. And the truth is, the significance of the patriarchs is not their masculinity. The significance of the patriarchs has more to do with qualities that are considered to be associated with them. So that Abraham is associated with chesed, with loving kindness. Isaac is associated with justice, with din, and Jacob is considered a combination of the two, which is, I believe, rachamim, which is a combination of both love and justice. And that's really what is supposed to be focused on. And again, one can sort of see a little bit of an effect. This isn't stuff that is expressed explicitly in the Talmud. I think the Talmud also wants us to use our own minds and to try to use our own meditations on these various things. And it sort of gives us an opening in which to think about this. In what sense would you want the morning to represent love and divine love and the human practice of chesed? And in what sense would the afternoon be a good time to look into right behavior, acting in a just way, etc., and the evening representing a combination of these two, because the evening is a wonderful time to reflect, and in fact, it's a practice that's out there of reflecting on the day that's passed and thinking about it and thinking about what you did right and what you did wrong and what you need to change. That's something you do. It's a practice that one can do, that evening meditation, as to what it's supposed to basically focus on. So the men of the Great Assembly were very meticulous in the words that they chose, in how many words there were in the Amidah. They were able to focus in a very deep kind of way, because we know that the more you know something, the more you're able to pull it apart and find the details, the very fine details regarding almost anything, any subject. You start to be able to do that. So they were capable of it. And of course, what happened was, in the course of the centuries, the prayer book gained other particular elements to it that gained popularity and acceptance. And essentially, the traditional prayer book is the result of all these, accretions that happen. But the very essence of it, nevertheless, is the Amidah. And that's some background, and I'm happy to take questions if you have any.
I have one comment.
Yes.
This, to me, says that it's about community. And it's about doing all of these different things to bring everyone together at different times. Even way back when the sacrifices were happening in the temple, then people were in like mind to be focusing on not only themselves and their community, but for those who were doing the sacrifices or that for the community, but also linking everyone together as one people throughout time.
Yes. What you say has a lot of validity. They say that at Mount Sinai, when they first arrived at Mount Sinai, that the Jewish people were totally unified, and had they not been totally unified, they never would have received the Ten Commandments. So the idea of knowing how to get along, both personally and publicly, is obviously, in order to achieve that unity, is something very fundamental, and I think you were bringing that out. I would say there's another important element, though, that I think is sometimes neglected, and that is a sense of duty. That sometimes you do things not because you want to do them, but because you have to do them, because it's the right thing to do, and not to make it, always around what one personally, one's personal tastes. And very often achieving unity involves that sense of responsibility and duty. And seeing, because I think most people look at these prayers as simply being, I enjoy going and that's why I do it. I mean, it's not for me necessarily to try and judge everyone, but that's my sense as to why it's neglected, because it's not seen as something important and as an important responsibility. Um, and I could certainly go into various reasons why, beyond even the very fact that since we are commanded to do it, it may be a rabbinic command and not a biblical command, but that doesn't make it any less valid. And certainly rabbinic commands, without any doubt, take into account the point you were making, Lisa, about creating community. But so it's in Hebrew, we don't understand Hebrew, it can be tedious, it's repetitious, etc. And those are not necessarily things that are appealing unless you sort of have developed a taste and an understanding and this sense of moral duty, that it's something that one does as a Jew. Now, that traditionally women were not obligated to do this. And the reason for this was because for most women, not necessarily all, but for most women, they had to take care of raising the children. And of course, the way families were back then, etc., and the fact that it was an extremely laborious process to take care of domestic chores and other kinds of things. Back then, it was felt as unfair to obligate women to come to Minyan or to do time-bound positive commandments. Now, we conservative Jews, at least within conservative Judaism, believe that the situation has changed. And when circumstances alter, they need to, then the halacha is able to accommodate various elements that involve circumstances. And it's still, of course, terribly important that if you do have children, that they get all the attention they need, and they need a lot of attention. But at the same time, it's sensed that, women may in fact want to take on this obligation, and that they should have that opportunity to take it on as an obligation.
I have one more comment,
Sure.
please.
Yeah.
It's about the obligation, and then the juxtaposed with the liking to do it, and then the Hebrew in there, kind of in the middle, that where you don't understand, and the repetition. Except what I love about all of that coming together is that's how you learn.
I agree.
You show up, and if it's that you just love to hear it and it makes you have the warm fuzzies, that's wonderful. And if you do it from, it's an obligation, it's a duty, and I want to do it. Those two things are so valid, because ultimately it brings you to an understanding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The
Golda?
thing that we never learn in Hebrew school or in religious school or anything, and this is a big deal with me, it's a music thing too, but we never learn how to do it. What we're really supposed to be doing, not just saying the words. When you get the words down, then there's the next level, and we never get to the next level with our kids. Which is the same thing with like music. We never learn how to practice. We just say practice. We don't learn what that really means for each person, because it's different. Same thing with talking to God. I mean, the first time I told my mother that you don't have to do the prayers in the book, you can read you can read something else. You can just, because she was not Hebrew literate at all, and it just would drive her nuts. It's like, you can read the English, Mom. You can read something else. You can just talk to God. You can just be who you need to be at that moment. And it just, like, she says, really? It says, yeah, really. It just, that's what people don't know.
So I would take what you're doing and reframe it a little bit to say that in discussion of whether one has fulfilled one's obligation, right? That's a sensitivity.
Mhm.
Right? Have you fulfilled your obligation? And the answer is, with regards to what you just said, is that if you pray the Amidah in English or in whatever language you understand, you have fulfilled your obligation. I mean, I hope
do you feel like, not just saying words, but knowing what you're saying, understanding the reasoning for these, because some of it's really archaic and it doesn't always make as much sense as it could.
Right. And so, I mean, I see my own responsibility as a rabbi and a teacher to try and take those things that superficially appear archaic and show that they actually have a lot of validity and application even nowadays. That's an important responsibility on my part. But
That's how we have to bring the next generations in.
Amen.
Right. Okay. We have to stop now. I'm going to stop the recording, and I hope you found this helpful.